So we're in your history book, and we're now in chapter 7 that has to do with the Civil War. And we talked about before the war and how things were going, and how the issue of slavery was becoming worse and worse, and lines were being drawn. And here, this chapter is about lines are drawn. So let's go on with this chapter. As a young adult, Abraham Lincoln moved to Illinois with his family and worked in a general store where his honesty and integrity gave him the nickname of Honest Abe. Lincoln also served in the Illinois state militia. After several years of study, he became a lawyer and built a successful practice. After he married, Lincoln served his state of Illinois in the United States House of Representatives. He was asked to be governor of the Oregon Territory, which was free, in 1849, but chose instead to run for a seat for Congress. So Abraham Lincoln, we know Abraham Lincoln's going to be president during the Civil War. So here's a picture of him right here. So anyway, Abraham Lincoln ran against Stephen Douglas to represent Illinois as a senator. He challenged Douglas to several debates where both men argued that his ideas about government were best. So he was running in Illinois against Stephen Douglas, who also is very famous as a senator. During these debates, Lincoln shared his belief that unless slavery was stopped, it would spread across the whole United States. Many people in free northern states agreed with Lincoln. Many in the South did not and declared they would never vote for him to become president. They knew if Lincoln became president, what would they do? Leave the United States. So here's the Lincoln and Douglas debate. Here's a picture of Abraham Lincoln, what he looked like. So let's go on, and here, of course, your terms and your dates and stuff. So you can always look back to here to find some of your answers when you're looking for things, questions on this section. So I'm not going to go over those because we will be going over them. So, Lincoln knew that sooner or later America would have to reach a decision about slavery. He addressed the Illinois Republican State Convention in 1858 and used an idea from the Bible verse to make his point. Oh, what did he say from the Bible? He said, "A house divided against itself cannot stand. I believe this government cannot endure permanently half slave and half free. I do not expect the Union to be dissolved. I do not expect the house to fall, but I do expect it will cease to be divided. It will become all one thing or all the other." Which it has, huh? So he said that this United States cannot be divided. So when Abraham Lincoln was defeated by Douglas in the Illinois Senate race, he set higher goals. He decided to run for president. This would put Lincoln in the position to lead the United States during a very difficult time in American history. So Lincoln becomes president. In 1860s, the presidential election, Lincoln ran against James Buchanan. Abraham Lincoln won and became the first Republican president of the United States of America. Lincoln urged the North and the South not to become enemies. His greatest desire was to keep the United States together. He feared that a sad and horrible war was about to begin, and Lincoln was right. Before he took office in 1861, this is even before, as the 16th president, 7 southern states had already left the Union under James Buchanan. 7 of them had already left the Union. I never knew that, but they left during Buchanan, even before Lincoln. So now he would have to deal with this. The Confederate States of America. When the southern states began leaving the Union during Buchanan's presidency, South Carolina led the way. On December 20th, 1860, that's 1860, we're talking about, 150 years ago, South Carolina's state government chose to succeed or leave the Union. Succeed means leave. Within a short time, Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas also succeeded and joined South Carolina. These states decided to form their own nation and call it the Confederate States of America. They were going to be their own nation. What states were these? So let's go over them again. The first one would be South Carolina, then on to Mississippi, number 2, Florida, 3, Alabama, 4, Georgia, 5, Louisiana, 6, and Texas, 7 states. Instead of the United States, the country was divided. The Confederate States elected a new president, and they called him Jefferson Davis. They chose Montgomery, Alabama, as their first capital, but only for a short time. Davis told the people of the South that if a war were to be fought, it would be for freedom and independence from the government that took away the rights of the Southern states. The practice of slavery is one of the main rights for which they were ready to fight for. After the first 7 states withdrew and formed the confederacies, others would follow. So here's a picture of Abraham Lincoln here at the bottom. 16th, remember, 16th president. Pretty important to remember that. And during the Civil War, he's going to be issuing what's called the Emancipation Proclamation, which would end slavery in the slave states, in the Confederate States. And he signed the Homestead Act into law, and we're going to talk about that later. And he was assassinated. We're going to talk, he was actually shot and assassinated in Ford's Theater, but we'll talk about that a little bit too. The troops. President Lincoln knew that he would not permit the Southern states to leave the Union and create their own country. They would have to be stopped. When Lincoln asked for soldiers, thousands enlisted in the Union Army. Union or Northern soldiers hoped to keep America united as one country. As the Confederate States built their own government, they also built an army. Thousands of men answered the call of Jefferson Davis to volunteer for the new Confederate Army. Confederate or Southern soldiers joined the army because they wanted the Southern states to be independent and free to govern themselves. Both sides knew that this was not just any war. It was a terrible civil war that would be fought against other Americans instead of against a foreign country. Relatives would even face each other, brother against brother. How horrible. The generals. The Union Army had many important generals throughout the war, but the most well-known were General George B. McClellan and General Ulysses S. Grant. These are of the North. General McClellan, the commander of the Union Army of the Potomac, prepared his troops well for battle and saw many victories against the Confederate Army. However, he was later replaced by Abraham Lincoln after not moving as quickly as Lincoln hoped in the battle against the Confederates. As a general in the Union Army, Grant would go on to lead his men to many victories. After his troops had captured a Confederate fort, General Grant said he would accept no terms except unconditional surrender. That's why they called him Unconditional Surrender Grant. His answer made him famous throughout the North. In 1864, toward the end of the war, President Lincoln made General Grant the commander of all the Union armies. The thought of war greatly troubled Robert E. Lee. He was a colonel in the United States Army, Robert E. Lee. He loved the United States and could not bear the thought of it becoming divided at all. And he wasn't a slave holder. He didn't even believe in owning slaves. Although President Lincoln asked him to lead the Union Army, Robert E. Lee left his post to eventually become the commander of the Confederate Army. When his home state of Virginia succeeded, he loved Virginia, he loved his family, he loved his people, so he decided to go with the state of Virginia and become the commander of the Confederate Army, and he was an amazing man. So Lee felt it was his duty to follow Virginia. He could not fight against his own friends and family. So let's go back here and look. Here's a picture of the Union in blue here, in the gray. We have the Confederate. So here's a picture. Down here's a picture of two generals that were of the North. This is George B. McClellan. He had fought mostly, on the coast, on the northern coast areas, around Richmond and that area and stuff. But McClellan, he was eventually replaced by Ulysses S. Grant, who ended up becoming the commander-in-chief under Lincoln. And of course, here's a picture now of Robert E. Lee, and a very, very devout. He actually was a devout Christian too, but that he fought as commander, and he was one very great coming to as a commander in himself, Anyway, but he was of the North, or he was of the South. I'm sorry, he's of the South. So North, Grant's of the North and Lee of the South. Okay, and Lee would be surrendering to Grant. So really, when you think of Robert E. Lee, you think, why did he ever decide to fight for the Confederates? The main reason was because he loved his state of Virginia, and he couldn't bear fighting against his own family. So, Fort Sumter, what happens now? The Union Army occupied several forts located in the new Confederate states. Fort Sumter was in Charleston, South Carolina. So remember, Fort Sumter, is in the Confederate area, but it's occupied by Union soldiers. So Fort Sumter was built by the United States Army after the War of 1812. Since South Carolina had succeeded, the Confederates wanted to take Fort Sumter from the Union Army, but the Union did not agree, of course. In the early morning of hours of April 12, 1861, this is very important, April 12, 1861 is the year, the Confederate troops aimed their guns at Fort Sumter. Although it was still dark, the people of Charleston came out of their houses to watch as the first shots were fired, marking the beginning of the American Civil War. Question: when did the Civil War begin? 1861. So in April. The Union troops inside Fort Sumter had few supplies. They fought for 2 days, but at last had to surrender the whole fort. The United States flag was taken down from the fort, and the Confederate flag was raised in its place. The Confederate troops celebrated their first victory. Little did they realize what a long and horrible war lay before them. They thought the North would want to keep fighting, or they thought the North would not want to keep fighting. They thought that England and France would come and help them. Why would you think England and France would come and help them? Because they bought their cotton. And if they didn't, they depended on the cotton from the South. So they thought that England and France would come to help them. But they were wrong. Because of the issue of slavery, even England and France didn't want to come and help the Confederates. Here's a picture of Fort Sumter here. I could say, what a battle. And this was Fort Sumter in South Carolina, which started the Civil War. Here's a picture again. Now we'll see what the slave straits. Remember, the other was before the war. Now we'll see what happens. And here we have the blue ones. See, the blue are the Union states, California and Oregon, and then we have Iowa, Minnesota, Wisconsin, all of these here in the north. Bleeding Kansas became a Union state, of course, but of course they had issues because they were made a slave state and they didn't want to be. And all these green ones are territories. But here are the border states that decided. The border states had not decided to join the Confederacy, and they were Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland. They're all border states here. West Virginia was divided. So it used to be Virginia and West Virginia, but West Virginians, they did not want slavery, so they divided from Virginia. So West Virginia was totally against slavery. And so all these northern states, which include Minnesota, Wisconsin, Iowa, Illinois, Indiana, Ohio, Pennsylvania, and all of the coast here of Maine, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, Connecticut, Rhode Island, New Jersey, Delaware would be a border state. And all these in the South would decide. Virginia, North Carolina, South Carolina, Georgia, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, Arkansas, Texas, and Florida would decide to join the Confederacy. So So the battle at Fort Sumter saddened President Lincoln. He believed the Union must be saved. He asked for 75,000 more men to volunteer as soldiers. Within days, thousands of men answered his call. The states chose sides. The southern states of Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas had not joined the Confederate States of America. When President Lincoln called for more soldiers to defend the Union in 1861, these same 4 states had no desire to fight against their own southern neighbors. Instead, they joined the Confederacy. Soon the Confederate government moved its capital from Montgomery, Alabama, to Richmond, Virginia. The main capital would be Richmond, Virginia. So here we have these states of Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas. They didn't want to fight about the issue of slavery at first, but then they realized that they couldn't stand against their neighbors, and they decided to join in the midst. Now, some of these countries, Virginia especially, and Tennessee, had quite a few slaves in the midst of their country too. So their capital was at Montgomery, Alabama, just for a short time, and they moved it to Richmond, Virginia. And here's a pic. Where's Richmond, Virginia? Richmond, Virginia. Here's Virginia up here, Richmond, Virginia. Even though Virginia joined the Confederacy, the people of the state were divided over the issue of slavery. Those who were against slavery formed the separate state of West Virginia in 1861. West Virginia joined the Union in 1863. So, almost heaven, West Virginia. Have you ever heard that song? Anyway, 11 states now made up the Confederate States of America, while 23 states still belong to the Union. The border states of Maryland, Kentucky, Missouri, and Delaware, there's 1, 2, 3, 4, chose to remain in the Union even though they were in favor of slavery. So 1, 2, 3, 4 states. 2 other states joined the Union during the Civil War era. Nevada became part of the United States in 1864, and Nebraska joined in 1867 after the war ended. And so in those areas, they became free states, Nevada and Nebraska. Okay, let's see. In God we trust. What's this say? This is shortly after the Civil War began, Pennsylvania minister wrote to Salmon P. Chase, the Secretary of the Treasury. In his letter, he asked Secretary Chase to consider including a motto on the United States coins that stated America's trust in God. The minister hoped that the coins would remind citizens of God's protection and blessing on America. Other concerned citizens made the same kind of request. Secretary Chase wrote back to the minister, "Dear sir, no nation can be strong except in the strength of God, or safe except in his defense. The trust of our people in God should be declared on our national coins." In 1864, the United States 2-cent coins were minted with the motto, "In God we trust." Here's the motto, "In God we trust." Later, the motto became to be used on other coins. In 1856, a bill was signed into law by President Eisenhower, way later on, that declared "In God we trust" as the national motto, which should appear on all United States currency. In God we trust. We gotta trust in God. That's a terrible time. So let's do and this is just a matching. So here's over here, we'll say, and let's go over these. Who led the Confederate Army? Let's look over here. D, Robert E. Lee. Who was the unconditional surrender leader? That definitely was Ulysses S. Grant, C. The first shots of the Civil War were fired where? Let's look here. Where were they fired? Fort Sumter, the fort. The first Republican United States president was Abraham Lincoln, right? He was the first Republican president. The president of the Confederate States was, of course, Jefferson Davis, A. The Confederate capital moved here from Alabama. Moved from Alabama to where? Richmond, Virginia. Richmond, Virginia was really known as the Confederate capital. It's so close to the Washington, D.C. if you go there. Corey and Rachel and the kids, they live in Richmond. and they're about 100 miles from Washington, D.C. I've gone there. So here we go. Here's the letters here for you to know. One more short answer one here. How was the American Civil War going to be different from other wars that the Americans had fought? How did you think? Well, because the Americans were fighting against each other, even families against each other, brother against brother, fighting against some in the North, and the issue of slavery was a diehard for some people. Totally were against it, and others were totally for it. So that they were fighting against each other. That's what made it different than other wars. The Union general commanding the Army of the Potomac was General George McClellan. Remember that picture of him? Go back to him. He was right here, McClellan. But he was replaced later on by Grant, Ulysses S. Grant. In what year were the first shots of the Civil War? 1861. It's important you remember that year, 1861.